Sometimes the wildest hearts don't need cages, they just need someone to listen. When a wounded lion met a quiet girl with a wooden flute, the world held its breath and witnessed something no one could explain. If you believe in second chances and quiet miracles, type Amen below. And share this story with someone who still believes love can tame even the fiercest storms. The wind in Boulder, Colorado carried a sharpness only late October could summon. Crisp golden leaves rattled along the pavement as the sun hung low behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the packed field at the foothills. The sky was streaked with hues of copper and violet as the crowd gathered shivering in jackets and flannel boots, crunching gravel. A stage had been erected at the center of the Rocky Edge Wildlife Expo half-carnival, half-ego-fueled spectacle funded and curated by Clayton Rourke himself. Clayton Rourke, 54, stood tall on the temporary platform, with a tailored navy coat hugging his lean frame, a silver tie gleaming beneath his sculpted chin. His hair, salt and pepper and slicked back, gave him a polished look that did nothing to hide the sharpness in his jawline or the cold calculation in his storm-gray eyes. Once a Wall Street power broker, he had shifted his ambition toward more primal trophies, owning and displaying the most dangerous exotic animals alive. It wasn't admiration he sought, it was dominance. He raised a gloved hand and the speakers cracked to life. $1 million, he said, voice crisp, slicing through the murmurs like a blade. To anyone who can get the king to sit beside them, calm, obedient for 5 uninterrupted minutes. A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Ranchers in weathered denim and breeders in branded vests exchanged wary glances. Tourists pulled their scarves tighter, drawn by both curiosity and unease. Near the edge of the arena stood a massive steel cage, reinforced with layered mesh and bolted to the gravel below. Inside paced the lion. King was unlike any zoo-kept beast. His golden mane had dulled with dust and time and scars, latticed his muscular frame like a battle map. His left ear bore a ragged tear, and his right flank was furrowed with old burns. He paced with restless fury, each paw pressing divots into the ground. His amber eyes flicked from the crowd to the handlers to the cage door, as if measuring escape, defiance, and consequence all at once. No one dared approach. The handlers, 2 burly men in reinforced vests, sweat beading on their brows, stood a cautious distance from the cage. One of them, Travis, was broad-shouldered with cropped black hair and a jaw set like stone. He'd once broken a bull's horn with nothing but a gate chain. Now he gripped a tranquilizer pole like a lifeline. Beside him, Reuben, older and lankier, wiped his palms repeatedly on his jeans. They had wrestled everything from wild boars to rogue cougars, but this was different. King didn't look cornered. He looked betrayed. Clayton gestured toward the cage. "Let's begin." A brave soul stepped forward, a young man in his 20s, tall with shaggy blonde hair and too much swagger for his own good. He made it 3 steps before King lunged at the bars with a roar so guttural it sent nearby crows into flight. The man stumbled back, pale and shaking. Laughter erupted from a few corners, but it was nervous hollow. And then she appeared. No announcement, no fanfare. Just the soft crunch of small feet on gravel. She looked out of place, almost like a shadow wandering into the wrong world. Lila Morgan was 11 years old, slender to the point of fragility, her brown hair falling unevenly across her cheeks as though it had been cut with dull scissors. Her coat hung on her like it belonged to someone else, sleeves rolled and still too long. She wore faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, and her eyes, a muted blue-gray, did not blink as they locked onto the lion. She walked past gawkers and gaspers, past the startled handlers, and past Clayton Rourke himself, who frowned slightly, but said nothing. Her presence didn't fit the narrative he had curated. This wasn't drama. It was disruption. Lila didn't speak. She didn't look around. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a carved wooden flute worn smooth at the grip. No one noticed the initials etched faintly into its side. E-H. She stood a few feet from the cage and lifted the flute to her lips. The first note was shaky, almost lost in the wind. But the second carried. Then the third. It wasn't a melody anyone recognized, but it hummed with something ancient and quiet. King froze. His tail flicked once sharply, then stilled. He turned his head, not with the reflex of a predator, but the cautious curiosity of something long hunted. His ears pricked forward. His muscles still tight seemed to shift. The growl died in his throat. The handlers exchanged stunned glances. Clayton narrowed his eyes. Lila played on breath steady now. The tune had no words, but it spoke. Not commands, not demands, just presence. A low, meandering invitation. And then slowly the lion sat. The crowd gasped. 5 minutes passed in silence. No stopwatch was needed. Time itself had stopped. Clayton stepped back from the railing, jaw clenched. Somewhere in the silence, the game had changed, and he hadn't written the rules. Lila lowered the flute and looked at the lion. King looked back. Neither moved. And in that frozen tableau, a girl and a beast became something else. Not show, not spectacle. Something human and something ancient. And everyone watching knew they had just witnessed the beginning of something no one could control. The wind changed that night. It came down the mountain in quiet breaths, gentle yet persistent whispering through the pine branches and slipping beneath the worn shingles of the Morgan ranch house. Situated on the western edge of Boulder, the house stood modest and sun-faded, wrapped in white rail fencing and framed by pasture land that sloped toward the base of the Rockies. By morning, frost glazed the grass like sugar, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. Inside, Margaret Morgan stirred a kettle to life on an iron stove. At 65, Margaret was a woman built of frontier lines, broad-shouldered and lean. Her long gray hair pinned into a low knot, her cheeks weathered from years of sun and worry. She had once taught music at the community college, but traded pianos and sheet music for farm chores and solitude after the accident that took her daughter. Since then, she spoke with measured calm, never wasting words, always watching the world, like it might break again at any moment. She glanced through the window, seeing the silhouette of her granddaughter crouched in the frost-speckled field. Lila sat cross-legged in the brittle grass, her back to the house wrapped in an oversized green coat. A few feet away stood King, the lion tail curled loosely beside his paw prints. Muscles still but alert. The sight stirred something inside Margaret, equal parts fear, reverence, and awe. Lila hadn't said a word since they'd brought King home the night before. No one had asked why she insisted. The sheriff had looked at Margaret like she'd lost her mind, but no one had dared argue after seeing what happened at the expo. King had walked beside the girl without rope or bribe, passing the startled handlers and a speechless Clayton Rourke. That night they rode back in the old truck, King lying silent in the bed with Lila beside him, one hand resting gently on his flank. Margaret drove with both hands white on the wheel. The front door creaked. Margaret turned as Lila entered, cheeks pink from the morning air. She held the flute loosely in one hand. "He didn't eat," Lila said, barely above a whisper. Margaret set down 2 mugs of tea. "Give him time. He's not sure what peace feels like yet." They drank in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. Lila looked toward the hearth, where a quilt and dog bowl sat unused. "He's not a pet." "I know." That afternoon, a truck pulled up the gravel road, its rusting frame groaning with each bump. Behind the wheel was Dr. Julian Brooks. Tall and wiry with crow's feet around his eyes and a faded veterinary logo on his cap, Julian had once been the county's top animal specialist until a dispute with the state wildlife department over ethical treatment drove him out. Now he ran a mobile clinic and took cases others wouldn't touch. He stepped out brushing dust from his canvas coat. "You weren't kidding," he muttered to Margaret as King emerged from behind the barn. Julian didn't reach for a leash. He didn't step forward. Instead, he crouched slowly, eyes level with the lion. "That's a lot of trust you're carrying there." King didn't move. Lila stood nearby, flute in hand. Julian nodded at her. "You the music teacher now?" She didn't answer. Julian unpacked his bag in silence, laying out supplies on the porch: antiseptic gauze, a small scanner. "Let's see what we're working with." It took nearly an hour before King let him touch his side. The moment Julian's fingers traced the thick ridge of scar tissue beneath the lion's ribcage, he frowned. "This isn't from a fight," he murmured. "This is surgical. Internal stitching. Foreign implant site." Margaret's expression darkened. "You think he was tagged?" "Tagged, monitored, maybe more. Some of these international collectors treat animals like living test labs. He's been through something structured, deliberate." Julian stepped back, exhaling slowly. Whoever did this, they trained him with fear. Not food, not praise, punishment, and silence. And whatever broke him, it wasn't quick. That night, King lay beneath the cottonwood tree, eyes half-lidded. Lila sat near him, not speaking, just playing her mother's flute. The melody floated through the field like mist bending with the grass. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He just listened. In the kitchen, Margaret pulled a worn photo from a drawer. Eliza, her daughter, standing barefoot beside a horse with a young Lila in her arms. Her eyes lingered on Eliza's face. Wide smile, wild hair, fierce tenderness. She had once said that music wasn't for performance, it was for connection. The wind outside shifted again. At dawn, Lila stepped out to find King waiting near the gate. Not pacing, not tense, just waiting. She walked beside him down the fence line. Birds scattered ahead of them, but King did not chase. He moved like something rediscovering itself, like the mountain wind, wild, but not cruel. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Autumn deepened its grip on the valley, and the shadows stretching across the Morgan Ranch grew longer with each passing day. The trees along the fence line shed their gold in lazy spirals, carpeting the earth with a silence that felt sacred. Overhead geese called southbound in jagged formation. Life at the foot of the mountain had slowed to its quiet rhythm, but the ripple of what had happened at the expo still moved like an underground current through the community and through Clayton Rourke. Clayton sat in the dark-paneled study of his mountain estate, a glass of untouched whiskey resting in his palm. His broad-shouldered frame leaned forward, elbows on knees, narrowed at the paused footage on his monitor. The screen froze on the image of Lila standing still, flute at her lips, the lion seated before her. He pressed play, watched again, paused again. The video had gone viral despite his team's efforts. It was reshared, dissected, praised. Commentators called it a miracle. Scientists speculated endlessly. Public sentiment shifted. And Clayton, accustomed to bending both people and markets, watched his narrative unravel in real time. He jabbed a finger at the intercom. "Bring in Everett." Minutes later, a tall, compact man entered. Everett Lang, mid-40s, trim beard, dark slacks and turtleneck, more corporate than cowboy, but with the quiet edge of someone who'd once worn boots in deserts, no map names. He had been Clayton's fixer for years, known for getting things done without a ripple. Clayton didn't look up. "She made me look like a fool. And the lion." "Public's calling it connection," Everett said. "Some kind of bond, not training." "It's a threat to control," Clayton snapped. "Find out what facility that lion came from. I want names, handlers, records. If anyone buried anything, dig it up. Everett nodded. And the girl? Clayton finally looked up, eyes cold. I don't care how, but find out what makes her special. Back at the Morgan Ranch, the wind carried no such schemes. It moved gently through the rafters of an old barn, now converted into a quiet sanctuary. Margaret had cleared space near the rear stalls, placing thick bedding down for King. She had also restored an old feeding trough into a custom drinking station, though King still refused food. Julian visited again on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving with a small black and tan hound in the passenger seat of his truck. The dog, maybe 5 years old, had a crooked tail and a pink scar across its right eye. Julian called him Coop. Coop jumped down and sniffed the air before trotting up to King's resting spot. The lion's ears flicked, but he didn't rise. Coop sniffed again, let out a soft woof, and sat. He's my tester, Julian said, crouching beside Lila, who watched from the barn loft. I bring him in when I'm not sure if a new animal is too far gone or just scared. He usually knows. Lila said nothing, but her eyes tracked every movement. Julian gently examined King again, this time brushing the mane aside to inspect his neck more carefully. There's a ridge here, he muttered. Thin scar, almost hidden. Feels like there might have been a chip. Like a tracker? Margaret asked from the doorway. Possibly. But it's deeper. This wasn't just for location, it's surgical. Possibly a behavior device. Military contractors were playing with things like that years ago. Biofeedback tech. Illegal now, but that's never stopped the rich. Julian pulled out a scanner. It beeped faintly over the area. Still active. I'll need to remove it. But we'll do it here. Quiet. No clinics. No reports. That night, under lantern light, and with Margaret on watch, Julian removed a small implant the size of a fingernail from beneath King's skin. It pulsed faintly blue. Lila, standing by with her flute clutched tightly, didn't flinch. The next morning, King rose and walked the perimeter of the field for the first time. Still slow, still guarded, but different. When Lila played again, he didn't just sit. He lay down beside her. From the porch, Margaret watched with arms folded. He's listening more, she said quietly. Julian, sipping lukewarm coffee, nodded. Because someone's finally speaking in a way he understands. Across the ridge, Everett parked his SUV beneath a camouflaged overhang near the former wildlife auction grounds. He met with a woman named Helen Dorsey, a former handler turned whistleblower. She was in her late 30s, lean with sharp cheekbones and sun-damaged skin. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handed over a flash drive. That lion. His name was Subject 8K22 in the Rourke-funded program, she said. Conditioning stress stimuli suppression collars. He resisted everything. Never broke. They wanted to erase him. And the girl? Helen shrugged. I've seen hardened trainers scream for months and get nothing. She played a tune, and he followed. Maybe she didn't teach him. Maybe she just gave him back something he lost. Everett drove away in silence, the mountains casting long evening shadows behind him. The morning after the implant removal, the sun rose reluctantly behind a veil of gray clouds, casting a muted silver over the Morgan Ranch. Fog clung to the pastures like breath held in waiting, and the air smelled faintly of damp cedar and cold earth. The land seemed suspended between storms, between seasons, between truths waiting to be uncovered. Lila sat near the barn doorway, knees drawn to her chest, her flute resting on her lap. King was just beyond her, resting in a patch of straw, his breathing steady but eyes open. There was something watchful in his stillness now. Not tension, but awareness. As if part of him had returned and was quietly testing the edges of the world again. Julian arrived just before noon, accompanied by a woman Lila didn't recognize. She stepped out of the truck, slowly, careful not to startle the lion. Tall and broad-hipped, She wore a long canvas coat over faded jeans and boots stained with mineral red dust. Her name was Dr. Sienna Ward, a wildlife biologist in her early 40s, with auburn hair tied in a low braid and crow's feet that deepened when she smiled, but she wasn't smiling now. Julian introduced her simply. She used to track big cats in Botswana. If anyone can tell us what was done to him, it's her. Sienna crouched low a few feet away from King, her voice low and melodic. "Hello, old boy. Let's see what secrets they left in you." Lila watched silently as Sienna examined the now healing incision on King's neck. Julian handed her the removed implant sealed in a plastic container. The woman turned it over in her palm, brow furrowing. "This is not a GPS tracker," she said. "It's a neural disruptor." Julian leaned in. "For behavior control," Sienna nodded. "These are designed to release controlled pulses to suppress instinctive reactions, fight, flight, even hunger. It's banned in most countries. Only rogue operations use these now poachers' private collectors, sometimes militarized exotic programs." Margaret joined them on the porch, arms crossed. "And you think someone used this on King?" Sienna's voice was grim. "They didn't just use it. They buried it so deep they didn't want it found." Later that afternoon, while King rested beneath the cottonwood tree, Lila wandered into the old tack shed behind the barn. Dust filtered through slats in the roof like falling ash. She wasn't looking for anything, but her fingers traced instinctively over the shelf where her mother's veterinary supplies once sat. Behind a box of bandages, something metallic glinted. She pulled it free. It was a tag, flattened, weathered, marked with foreign etching. A long string of letters and numbers. At the bottom, a small logo, a coiled spearhead overlaid with a lion's paw. Julian and Sienna examined it as the evening light faded. "This emblem," Sienna said, "belongs to the Black Fang Initiative." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Sounds made up." Sienna shook her head. "It's very real. A black market operation based out of Eastern Africa. They run high-end illegal hunts, big game only. Their methods are brutal. They take pride in turning predators into prey. Rourke's name was whispered in those circles years ago, but nothing ever stuck." Julian added, "Oh, now we've got something tangible. A device. A tag. A lion that lived through it." Lila stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself. Her mind wasn't on international conspiracies. It was on the way King still flinched when the porch door slammed too hard, the way he tensed at the rattle of chains. That night, she didn't play the flute. She sat beside him, back against the tree, letting the silence speak for her. Meanwhile, Everett returned to Rourke's estate, carrying a thick folder and a burned disc. Clayton stood by the fireplace, a fire crackling behind him, casting long shadows on the stone walls. "Well?" Clayton asked, not turning. Everett dropped the folder on a table. "We've confirmed the lion was part of the Black Fang string. Tagged suppressed, intended for high-stakes hunting. But he got transferred into your expo pipeline during the switch between handlers in Namibia. Someone buried the trail, but not well enough." Clayton finally turned. His face was unreadable, and the girl still watching, still playing music. No patterns of conditioning, just presence. Clayton paced, eyes narrow. "We need to control the narrative. If word gets out, this lion was part of an illegal program I backed. We're finished." Everett raised an eyebrow. "You mean you're finished?" Clayton didn't answer. He just looked out the window, where the mountain loomed quiet, indifferent. At the Morgan Ranch, Margaret finally retrieved Eliza's old journals from the attic, setting them on Lila's desk. Inside pages were filled with looping handwriting sketches of muscle systems and long notes about animal behavior. Lila turned to a page where her mother had written in thick, confident strokes, "Trauma doesn't erase instinct. It buries it. And with time and trust, it can rise again like spring thaw." Outside, King stirred. He rose, stretched, and for the first time since his arrival, he ate. Spring came early that year to the lower valley, slipping past winter's reluctant grip with sudden green shoots and wind that no longer stung. The pastures at the Morgan Ranch bloomed with wild mustard and baby's breath, painting the hills in soft gold and white. Birds returned in flurries, and insects hummed like quiet machinery in the grass. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel like it was holding its breath. King walked beside Lila along the eastern fence line, his movements no longer weighed down by suspicion. His shoulders still held power, but the tension that once shaped every step had begun to melt into something quieter, like a river that had learned to flow again. Lila carried her flute, but didn't raise it to her lips. It wasn't necessary now. Presence had replaced performance. They stopped near the far paddock, where wind rippled through tall grass like water. King lowered his head, sniffing the air, then looked to Lila as if waiting for permission before stepping forward. He moved slowly, tail swishing lazily nose, leading him toward a rustle near the thicket. There, tangled in a mess of barbed wire and branches, was a young deer. Its leg was caught twisted at an angle that made movement impossible. The fawn's chest rose and fell in fast jerks, eyes wide with panic. Lila froze. But King didn't pounce. He sat. Lila stepped closer, her voice soft. "It's okay. We're not here to hurt you." She reached carefully into her coat and pulled out the emergency wire cutters Margaret insisted she always carry. The barbs had nicked the deer's skin, but it wasn't deep. King remained a silent sentinel, as Lila worked his gaze fixed on the fawn, not like prey, but like a fellow creature caught in something bigger than fear. When the last wire snapped, the deer leapt away on 3 good legs, disappearing into the trees. King did not chase. Lila looked at him. "You knew." He blinked slowly, then turned to walk beside her once more. Back at the ranch house, Julian sat, hunched at the dining table, poring over papers, photos, and hand-scrawled maps. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, and a slight tremor had crept into his hands from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Across from him sat Marla Jennings, a retired investigative journalist in her late 50s, with cropped gray curls and a scar along her left cheekbone from her time covering poaching operations in Mozambique. Marla had once exposed an illegal primate trade ring in South America and had the lawsuits and the respect to prove it. She wore thick-rimmed glasses and a look that suggested she could smell lies before they were spoken. "Rourke's name isn't on any of the Black Fang paperwork," she said, flipping through files. "But you've got patterns, money trails, shell companies. And this," she held up the implant chip, "might be your Rosetta Stone." Julian rubbed his temples. "They've got lawyers stacked to the ceiling. Even if we drop it with the feds, they'll bury it in procedure. We need public momentum." Marla leaned back. "Then give them a story. A girl. A lion. A song. Truth rarely moves people, emotion does." In the loft above the barn, Lila read from her mother's journal, each page annotated in colorful inks with little musical symbols drawn beside observations about animal behavior. One passage caught her eye. No animal forgets how to listen, only how to feel safe while doing it. Later that week, King followed Lila to the creek that split the property's edge. The water was cold and fast from snowmelt. Lila removed her shoes and sat on a rock, dipping her feet into the stream. King stood at the edge, watching the water swirl, then stepped in, not leaping, not splashing, but easing one paw, then the next. Margaret, watching from the ridge, felt something shift. She clutched her thermos tighter and whispered, "You're not just healing him, Lila. You're showing him he was never broken." That night, Marla joined them for supper, bringing an old field camera and her dog Toby, a squat brown mutt with wiry fur and one ear that flopped sideways. Toby circled King, once gave a single sniff, then plopped down and fell asleep. It was the closest thing to royal approval anyone could hope for. Over lentil stew and cornbread, Marla shared stories from her years abroad, watching Lila's eyes light up when she mentioned rescuing a leopard cub in Kenya. When the conversation slowed, Marla leaned across the table. "You know, I've seen powerful people crumble over less than what we have. But what scares men like Rourke the most is when they're no longer the loudest voice in the room." Lila didn't respond with words. She simply reached for her flute and played. The song was slow and breathy, not mournful but honest. Outside, King lay under the cottonwood again, ears twitching with every note. In a nearby town, Everett monitored media chatter and tightened internal protocols. He filed a sealed notice to Clayton's legal team and began redacting sensitive names from archived export lists. But he hesitated on one file: Hayes Eliza, wildlife rehab specialist, deceased. He flagged it but didn't delete it, because even Everett, for all his pragmatism, felt the wind was changing. The day of the Boulder Valley Fair arrived with a sky scrubbed clean by overnight rain, the clouds pulling back like stage curtains to reveal a pale blue canvas. Sunlight bathed the sprawling fairgrounds in warmth, glittering off carnival rides' vendor tents, and the dust kicked up by cowboy boots and stroller wheels. Lila stood near the livestock ring, her coat zipped to the neck despite the spring sun. In her pocket, her mother's flute waited, its wood worn smooth, the initials E.H. nearly invisible now. Margaret stood beside her, a hand on Lila's shoulder. Her gray hair was pinned up, and she wore her old music teacher's pendant, a small silver treble clef that glinted in the light. "We don't have to stay long," she said quietly. Lila didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the stage being assembled in the center of the arena, where black speakers and polished metal fencing gleamed unnaturally against the earth. A loudspeaker cracked to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the headline event of the fair, sponsored by the Rourke Foundation for Human and Animal Advancement." Julian arrived with Coop in tow, the little hound's nose twitching at the smell of popcorn and hay. With them was Dr. Eli Thompson, a soft-spoken behaviorist in his early 30s, with thick-rimmed glasses and a clean shave that made him look younger than he was. Eli had flown in from Montana after reading Marla's early draft report. He was skeptical at first, but after spending 10 minutes watching King walk beside Lila at the sanctuary, he canceled his return ticket. "Clayton's using the fair to change the narrative," Julian said. "He's going to parade another lion out, claim his method works, not yours." "Not mine," Lila said. "King's." Clayton appeared atop the announcer's stand, wearing a pressed gray blazer, tailored jeans, and a microphone headset that framed his jaw like armor. His smile was broad, his tone polished. Today, he boomed, "We witness the culmination of modern behavior control, a demonstration in precision safety and mastery." Two handlers wheeled out a reinforced cage from the far end of the arena. Inside, a lion slightly smaller than King, darker fur, younger eyes, paced erratically. A thick harness covered its back, its fur matted where the straps dug in. At intervals, the lion let out guttural short roars that seemed to come more from fear than fury. The handlers opened the gate, slowly, shock batons at their sides. The lion stepped out stiffly, clearly agitated. When one handler raised a clicker and pressed it, the lion jerked as though struck by an invisible blow. Gasps rose from the crowd. Clayton's smile remained. "This is bravo," he announced. "A prime example of obedience through scientifically optimized correctional stimuli." In the stands, Julian muttered, "That's just a clean phrase for torment." Lila stepped forward before Margaret could stop her. King walked beside her, calm, steady. People made way. Murmurs followed in her wake. Clayton's microphone cracked again. "And now a special guest, our local prodigy. Let's give young Miss Morgan a warm welcome." Lila didn't look up. She stepped into the ring, King at her side, his presence like gravity. Across the ring, Bravo froze, his hackles raised, his chest expanded with a wheeze. Then as the clicker buzzed again, he flinched and turned toward King. The crowd leaned forward. Bravo lunged, but King didn't move. He stepped forward just enough to place himself between Lila and the younger lion, then slowly, visibly lowered himself to the ground. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, just lay there. Bravo skidded to a halt, confused. King looked at him. No challenge in his gaze, just invitation. Bravo's ears twitched. His breath heaved in shallow bursts. One paw stepped forward, then hesitated. He glanced back at the handler who held the remote clicker tight in a sweating grip. Lila reached into her pocket, pulled the flute free, and raised it to her lips. The sound was soft, breathy. No melody, no performance, just a thread of air woven into the air, like a memory made audible. The audience went silent. Even the handlers froze. Bravo turned his head. Then with a tremor that shook through his muscles, he sat. The harness on his back shifted. Lila stepped forward, still playing. Bravo crouched beside King. Then without instruction, he lay down fully, his chin resting on his front paws, his tail curling softly behind him. The edge in his eyes softened, and the ripple of tension across his shoulders stilled like water settling after a stone had dropped. Lila stopped playing. Slowly, she extended her hand toward Bravo's muzzle. He didn't flinch. His nose touched her palm. His body, tense moments ago, gave a small, exhausted shudder. Not from pain, but release. The arena stayed silent for a heartbeat, then another, and then came the surge, a wave of applause, shouts, camera flashes. But none of it reached Lila. She knelt and touched King's mane. Bravo lowered his head beside her knee. Margaret, watching with glassy eyes, whispered, "They didn't conquer. They just remembered who they were." Clayton's expression cracked for the first time. Behind him, Everett stood motionless, unreadable. Backstage, Marla clicked off her recorder. "That's your story," she said to Eli. "Now the world gets to decide what they believe in leashes or trust." That evening, Lila King and Margaret walked home under the dusky light. Bravo followed at a distance, his harness removed by the handlers who no longer knew what else to do. He didn't rush. He didn't pace. He simply followed like something lost that had finally found a shape it could move toward without fear. It began with one photograph, Lila kneeling in the dust between two lions. The image spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran it without captions, letting the weight of the moment speak for itself. Within 48 hours, Julian's compiled evidence package, meticulously organized with time-stamped images, interviews, implant analyses, and satellite logs, was delivered to major media outlets and federal authorities. Marla Jennings ensured that it wasn't just sent, it was received. By the end of the week, headlines screamed across digital front pages. "Rourke under investigation for ties to illegal wildlife trade lions. Lies and a little girl's song. Trust over tactics, the lion whisperer of Boulder Valley." Clayton Rourke vanished from public view. His estate's gate remained shut, his scheduled public appearances canceled. Everett Lang, ever composed, released a single statement on behalf of the Rourke Foundation. "We are cooperating fully with the investigation." But inside his quiet office, Everett was already packing files. He knew better than to stand in the way of momentum once it turned. Meanwhile, at the Morgan Ranch, spring continued to unfold as if the world beyond the ridge didn't exist. Lila spent her days not reading articles or answering calls, but tending to troughs, mending fences, and sitting silently beneath the cottonwood where King rested. Bravo no longer. Bravo now responded to a new name, River. Lila had chosen it without ceremony one morning as she watched him drink from the stream near the fence line. He moved differently now, more gently, as though the weight of being watched had finally lifted. "He's like a river," she said aloud, mostly to herself, not because he's calm, but because he carved his way through stone to find peace. Julian had smiled when he heard it. Margaret, though reserved, wrote it into the notebook where she kept records of all animals on the property. River wasn't King. His trust came slower, and his wounds, both seen and unseen, tugged more sharply at the surface. He was younger, leaner, with a darker mane that curled at the ends like scorched rope. He followed King, but not closely, as if studying his elder's stillness before committing to his own. Dr. Eli Thompson remained for longer than he planned. He moved into a spare room at the vet trailer behind the barn and helped repair the damaged west fence. He didn't speak much in the mornings, preferring coffee and note-taking. But in the afternoons, he sometimes sat cross-legged outside the enclosure, sketching the lions in a weathered notebook, he refused to let anyone read. "He's watching them like they're the ones teaching him," Margaret noted. "That's because they are," Julian replied, passing her a thermos of sweet tea. One afternoon, a television crew showed up unannounced. A woman in a bright red coat, hair blown out like a commercial, stood at the gate with a cameraman and assistant. Her name was Shelby Dean, host of a national news magazine program. She introduced herself with a practiced smile. "We'd love 5 minutes with Lila," she said. "Just a small segment, positive, uplifting. We think her story is exactly what the country needs right now." Margaret glanced over her shoulder where Lila was brushing River's side with a worn broom handle, her eyes half closed in focus. "No," Margaret said plainly. "She's exactly where she needs to be, and she doesn't owe anyone anything." Shelby's smile cracked slightly, but she recovered with a nod and a business card. "In case she changes her mind." She wouldn't. Inside the barn, Lila ran her fingers along the pages of her mother's journal. On one corner, barely visible under smeared ink, Eliza had written, "Don't ask the animal to forget. Teach it that it's safe to remember." Outside, River lay curled near the wildflower patch. King sat nearby, his gaze trained on the horizon, like he was still guarding the whole valley. That night, as dusk fell and the porch lights flickered to life, the ranch was quiet except for the low drone of insects and the shifting of hay. Julian and Eli shared a bottle of cider on the back steps, Coop snoring between them. Margaret closed her ledger with a satisfied sigh. Lila, sitting under the cottonwood, raised her flute not for performance, but as a gentle punctuation to a day well lived. The notes were slow, a lullaby for a world that had begun finally to listen. River stirred. He approached her slowly, and curled his massive body just near enough to feel her warmth. The flute stopped. Lila whispered, "You're safe now, both of you." She didn't need the cameras, or the headlines, or the applause. She just needed the silence that followed trust. The wind that swept through Boulder that morning was crisp clear, and full of something more than spring hope. A small stage had been set up near the tree line, where the pine forest met the last edge of the Morgan family's land. Folding chairs fanned out across the field like petals, and townsfolk began to arrive, not dressed in grandeur, but in warmth. This wasn't a celebration of status, it was a celebration of healing. Mayor Benjamin Cormack, a tall man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and the sun-lined face of someone who spent more time listening than speaking, stood beside the wooden podium. He wore a tan suit that wrinkled easily but was always clean, and his eyes crinkled with sincerity as he scanned the modest crowd. "I've signed the order this morning," he began, holding up a single document to transfer stewardship of this parcel of land, 38 acres, nestled against the Roosevelt National Forest, to the Morgan family for the explicit purpose of founding the mountain sanctuary. The crowd erupted in quiet, heartfelt applause. There were no fireworks, no media vans this time. Lila, standing beside her grandmother Margaret and Dr. Julian Brooks, didn't wear a dress, just her flannel shirt and jeans, the same ones she always wore when cleaning stalls or repairing wire fencing. Margaret looked over to her granddaughter with pride that didn't need words. The older woman's silver hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense braid, and her eyes, though tired, gleamed with the strength of someone who had watched the world change in slow, stubborn steps. She squeezed Lila's hand once, and Lila nodded back silently. Not far from the ceremony, in the open grass clearing, 2 lions lay beneath the shade of a pine king and River. They had grown even closer in the weeks since the fair, moving in tandem, like sentinels born under different moons, but made for the same sky. King's scars had faded into patterns of survival, and River had begun to gain weight, his eyes less cautious, more curious. Children tiptoed close to the fence, peeking through wooden slats to catch a glimpse of them. The lions didn't flinch. They were home. Julian stood to speak next. His brown hair had grown a bit shaggier in the past month, and his sleeves were rolled up as usual. He was never one for speeches, but his voice carried with a kind of unshakable clarity. "This sanctuary will not just be a place of refuge for animals," he said. It will be a place of education, of reconciliation with nature, with the past, and with ourselves. From the crowd, someone called out, "You've got our support." And they did. Volunteers had already signed up to help construct enclosures, to plant new grass, to build the visitors center. Eli Thompson, still living in his small trailer on the property, had designed the sanctuary's layout on dozens of hand-drawn blueprints, complete with native plant restorations and hidden pathways for nervous rescues. Marla Jennings had kept her promise and stepped back from the story once the truth was known. Sometimes she'd said a story's best ending is the part the cameras never film. In a quiet pocket of the field, a woman stood apart from the crowd, Sarah Hodge, a retired wildlife enforcement officer with sun-darkened skin and a limp from an old knee injury. She had been the one who anonymously sent a copy of Clayton's private flight logs to Marla. Her gray eyes watched Lila with a softness untouched by pity. "She's what I used to hope the world could be," Sarah whispered to herself, then turned to leave without being noticed. As the ceremony ended and the crowd drifted into conversations and shared hugs, Lila slipped away toward the edge of the pine grove. She carried with her the same wooden flute her mother had once given her, the one that had coaxed calm into a lion's heart and reminded the world that not everything needed to be controlled. She found her spot beneath the oldest tree roots rising like ribs from the earth and sat down. King approached first, slow and regal, settling beside her with a contented huff. River followed a little behind, stretching before curling into the grass. The sun began to set, casting honey-gold light through the trees, dappling everything in a soft glow. The moment held no tension, no conflict, no need to prove or persuade. It simply was. Lila raised the flute to her lips. She played not to perform, but to remember to remember. The mother who once sang to her in storms, the grandmother who never gave up the strangers who chose kindness over comfort, and the lions who taught her that strength isn't in the roar, but in the silence that follows. King's eyes drifted closed, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the music. In that moment, he was not a beast, not a prize, not a story. He was a king again. But this time, not of cages or headlines. He was the king of a quiet place where freedom was not just granted, but understood. And Lila, the girl with the flute and the scars invisible to the world, sat beside him, not a heroine, not a symbol, just a child who knew how to listen. Sometimes it's not the roar of a lion that changes everything, but the silence when it chooses to trust. Sometimes it's not the million-dollar promises or the flashing lights, but a little girl with a wooden flute and a heart wide enough to hold a storm. Lila didn't tame a beast. She healed a wound the world chose to ignore. Through her, a broken animal remembered peace, a scarred land began to breathe again, and even the coldest hearts found themselves thawing. And maybe, just maybe, that's how miracles work. Quiet, gentle, but powerful enough to rewrite the ending. If this story stirred something in your soul, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment and tell us what wound in your life found peace through compassion. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet miracles, unlikely friendships, and the fierce, gentle power of love. May God bless you and the animals He sends to lead us home.